This morning we continue our journey through the Bible at North Hills Church in this sermon series entitled Bible Stories You Ought to Know. And today we're stopping at Exodus 20. And you've probably heard, as Leo announced, that this is the chapter on the Ten Commandments. I can't stop for 10 weeks to talk about each one, as much as I would love to. And so I was presented with the problem this week, what commandment do we bring forward or do we highlight? And so I just chose the fourth. It's not to suggest that the fourth is the most important among all the 10. They're all equally important. But I did pull the fourth because I thought of all the 10, perhaps it's the one we have the most trouble obeying. I mean, commit adultery, I haven't. Steal, I wouldn't. Kill, I couldn't. Covet your goat, you can have your goat. Seriously, I don't want your goat. But keeping Sabbath? Now there's a spiritual practice I wonder if we all have a hard time keeping. God knows what life is like in this world, so God told us, God tells you, the one who made you, look, I wired you, and this is how I wired you. You're only good for 6 days, and every seventh, you have to stop and take a rest. Now that's what the word literally means in Hebrew, Sabbath. It literally means cease. Stop. If you will, if you can imagine, if you lived in a Hebrew world, okay, and we went to a four-way intersection after church, and we looked at a red octagonal sign there, the word on the sign would be our word Sabbath. It literally means stop. God says, look, you guys have got to come to a complete Sabbath, a cease and desist, a full stop, 1 day after every 6. This is how I wired you. Undeniable wisdom from our Creator if we listen to it. Because we have limits as finite beings, and it's not bad. It's just our reality of being the creature and not the Creator. There's limits to our capacities and energies and understanding and character and all of our capacities. So God commanded that we have to set all of that normal routine and rush aside and rest. And maybe, I don't know, but maybe this is the only reason God called you here today. Maybe that's just the one word God needs you to hear today from the pulpit. Stop. It's okay. Take a nap. The fourth commandment is not a benefits package for the believer. It's a commandment. God tells you, you have to stop. And maybe that's all you needed to hear today, that rest is a commandment. But I'll go on, because outside of that one word, this command to rest becomes even more wondrous, because God now, as the Bible will continue in stories that we can't look at today, will continue this theme of rest. Israel will later be told that after every 6 years of work, boom, you get a Sabbath year. 1 year after every 6. And then a special year after 7 cycles of that, the year of Jubilee, where all debts were erased. The ram's horn was blown on the Day of Atonement, and everybody goes home, back to where they came from. The old place you lost because it was in foreclosure, it's yours. A complete economic rest. You see, all the edge of the universe is touched by the grace of God. The walnut trees, the skies, you, the fish in the creek. There's not 1 square inch of the universe untouched by God's command to rest. Birds, fish, people, flowers, bank accounts, Everything is restored and renewed, no longer broken or shattered. It was tremendous hope for the people of the Old Testament. Everyone who lost their land because they had a famine year, they got it back. And you see, you can't spend your life accumulating, because after 50 years, you have to give it all back anyway. It was an antidote to greed. No point. You get rest, the land gets rest, the economy gets rest. And now, just think with me how this might have sounded out there in the desert to these slaves of Egypt. For 400 years, that's from today back to Christopher Columbus, 20 generations of your family have been enslaved making bricks. There was no day off for 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year, for 400 years. Moses now leads them out to the wilderness. He stops to them and he says to them, now get this. This is how free people live. You get a day off every week, and you have to take it. My guess is these slaves said, have to take it. Did you mean to say, get to take it? Don't have to repeat that commandment to me twice. Imagine the joy, you see, that this and all the commandments brought these first people. A day off wasn't even in their dictionary. And I think this too is how we are to receive this commandment to rest. It's a gift. You've won the lottery. Go home, put your feet up. No guilt, no shame. 1 day in 7, it's all yours. Use it. Now, of course, this hasn't always been the case. We've managed to make Sabbath, like all the commandments we tend to do, make it out of duty, and made it all about laws and rules. One of my favorite stories, and I can tell it because it comes from our own tradition. It's a true story, too. About 100 years ago in Friesland, the Netherlands, there was a Dutch Calvinist Reformed minister. And Friesland has a bunch of smaller villages, and so he was assigned 2 churches in remote villages. And the plan was that he would go preach the first service, and then after that service, ride his horse to the next village who had a late service, and the next week the late service people would be early, and he'd go back and forth. Fine. It worked great in the temperate months to take his ice skates with him to the first church. And afterwards, when that service was done, he would skate down the canal in a zip to make it in time to the second church service. And it worked like a charm until the elders figured out what he was doing. That the Domine was skating on a Sunday. So they called an emergency meeting to wade through the predicament. It was the best way to get a minister from point A to B in a winter month, but it was the Sabbath, and he was skating. So, their solution. They went back to the minister and said, okay, we've decided that you may skate between churches on Sundays. However, you may not enjoy it. Sorry, Anton, it cracks me up every time. I mean, was he doing triple axels, going back and forth? I don't know. But with all due respect, I think they totally missed out on that one. Not enjoy a Sunday? Where does it say that? As I said, I think the context completely answers that question. And that might be your one word. Receive today joyfully as a day of rest. Every Sunday. It's a gift from your Creator to you. But for some of us, I think there might be a second word we need to hear today also. And that is that Sunday is also more than just a day to take a nap. So work backwards with me. Why do we rest? To recharge. Why do we need to recharge? For our work. Why do we need to recharge for work? Because our calling, our work matters. It's how we contribute. It's how we give back to the world. Good. But we're not defined by our work, no matter what work we do. So we must need, by God's direction, to recharge for something else. And so here's the second word you need to hear. The Sabbath is not just a day of rest to recharge for work. The scripture makes it clear. It's also a day to remember. To remember what each and every day is for. And so that's why God goes out of his way when he describes the fourth commandment, that the Sabbath is a day to rest and remember. Not just to remember Sunday as the cease and desist day, but you use it to remember what every day is for, you see? And what is each and every day for? I think Jesus said it best. There was one time a person who stopped Jesus mid-tracks and tugged on his cloak and said, Jesus, you know, there's a lot of rules and a lot of commands. There's 614 of them in the Old Testament alone. Can you tell me which rule is the most important? In other words, that person was asking, what am I for? And Jesus says, here it is. Love the Lord your God with all you got, and then love your neighbor as yourself. So the Sabbath day, you see, is a day to slow down long enough so that we can remember and remind ourselves that we were created to love God and to love one another. That's what Sabbath's for. And that's why we come here, to remember, to worship God on Sunday. It's joyful. It's not always happy, maybe. It's not always easy. It may not be convenient, but that's what we're here for. Which is exactly why I think the devil will do every and anything possible in his power to talk you out of being here. For it's here, each and every Sunday, that we're reminded of the bigger picture of what we live for. Starting in January, I've been reading through C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity. I have forgotten what a marvelously profound work that is. And I was struck in there just last week by Lewis's description of worship. Now, in the text, he uses the word wireless, but you all know that that means radio. So when I do his quote here, I'm going to substitute the word radio where he has wireless. But this is how Lewis says it, and it's better than how I can say it. When you go to church, think of it like you are really listening in to a secret radio broadcast from friends and from God. This is why the enemy is so anxious to prevent us from going. He does it by playing on our conceit and laziness and intellectual snobbery. End quote. So this is why God gives us this practice of Sabbath, not just to stop, but to remember what we're never to stop. And what we are never to stop is loving God with all we've got and loving our neighbor as much as we love ourselves. Worship reminds us of that every single Sunday morning. It's a recentering. So there are your two words: rest, cease, desist, Sabbath. And remember. Remember to love God with all you've got and to love your neighbor as yourself. And so my question for all of us today is, how can you rest? How are you going to take this word home and apply it? What do you need to give up? What do you need to reprioritize? Do you remember how Dr. Hulst, just less than a month ago, challenged us, maybe here's one example, with all of our cell phone addictions? And don't tell me you don't have a cell phone addiction, we all do. And I've wondered a lot about that. And remember how she reminded us that research, especially on our children and grandchildren now, is proving over and over and over and over again that our brains simply weren't wired for non-stop 24/7 52 media blasts, TikTok videos, screen flashes, and swiping. And we're seeing the devastating results of that in the maturation of our children. And so part, I think, maybe of applying this fourth commandment to us in 2024 is to give up your cell phone. She encourages to do that. It's one small step. Remember, she said during church, start just by leaving your cell phone in your car. Did any of you do that today? Better, come to church, leave your cell phone at home. It'll be okay. Maybe Sabbath means cease and desist. All of this distractions of a screen. I know some of you have to use your phone on Sundays. That's okay. If you have to do it, just don't enjoy it. And the second word, how are we going to remember to love God and to love others, even loving those that you haven't yet met? God knows that we're going to have terrible, horrible days and demanding days and dull days and busy days and confusing days and stressful days, all of which distract us from the center, which is why we need to be here, reconnecting with each other and with God. So for this second word, asking you to apply it to your life today, here are my questions. I want each of you to think right now, who needs you? Who this week needs to hear from you? God doesn't give the law just to make you a better you. Who needs a phone call of encouragement? Who do you owe lunch? Who would enjoy a walk with you? Who do you know needs a reminder that you love them? If you've thought of somebody, remember them. And between now and the next time we gather for worship, I want you to commit to do something loving and tangible for that person you just brought to mind. It doesn't have to be big, it can be small. But do something to love your neighbor. Now, after you do that thing this week for your neighbor, then I want you to take a nap. And when you wake up from your nap on your own, just sort of assess. Now, how joyful was that? Amen.